for me. So I was actually writing a completely different talk earlier this week, and then that entirely fell apart. So I decided on Thursday to quickly pivot to something else, um,
Is that
something a
allowed
bit
here?
easier.
To screen share? Is that allowed here?
Uh, Sorry, I haven't clicked the button yet.
Okay.
Yep, that looks like it.
Good.
Um, right, so I thought I'd do the next part of my talk on Daniel. So I've been reviewing my sources since I did the last part in October last year, and funnily enough, there's 0% apocrypha in this one, just in case you're worried about that. Um, I came across a particularly good commentary on Daniel and Revelation that was written by a guy named Isaac Newton. It's called Observations upon the Prophecies of Daniel and the Apocalypse of St. John. If you're interested in having a read of it yourself, I recommend it. Um, so while Newton's best known for his work with apples, he was also an avid theologian and a historian, and well respected in his time for having an excellent, like absolutely top of his class understanding of the Bible and history, and he was a well regarded authority. Um, I think the Archbishop of Canterbury had said at one point that Newton knew more about the Bible than everyone else put together. So this is quite a good source on interpreting Daniel. Certainly knows more about history than I do. And having read through this book, I'd definitely say that he had a very clear understanding of the prophetic symbolism, what the symbols mean, how they're applied to, Daniel, Revelation, all these sort of things. Also has a great knowledge of history of not only the world but also the early church history. And he links all those things together to give a really solid interpretation of both Daniel and Revelation. So I'm drawing quite heavily on his works for this. So last time we'd gotten up to Daniel 11 verse 30, and now we get to the events that happen next. So I've only got one verse to go through today, and I think I've got time to go through one verse, which is Daniel 11 verse 31. It says here, "And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." So in my last talk on this topic, I think I'd said that this was talking about an event where the Seleucid king Antiochus IV desecrated the temple in Jerusalem. He sacrificed a pig on the altar. He sprinkled the books of the law with pig's blood, and forced the priest to eat pork. Now that was certainly an abominable thing to do, and it did briefly take away the daily sacrifice. But this wasn't the event that Daniel was foretelling. This is a bit of a red herring. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, Jesus talks about these events as well. He says, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains." And he goes on saying how bad it's going to be. The point is, Jesus talked about this prophecy that Daniel had made as though it hadn't been fulfilled yet. Jesus was talking about it in about 30 AD. So it couldn't possibly have been referring to an event that happened during the reign of Antiochus, way back in 160 BC. So there's another point as well. Um, there's some related prophecies in Daniel chapter 8, which also talk about the time when the abomination will be placed and the daily sacrifice will be taken away. And I referred to this last time also talking about Antiochus, but again, it's not the case. So here we read in Daniel chapter 8, it's talking about the four horns of the Greek kingdoms. Daniel 8 verse 9 says, "And out of one of the horns came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great towards the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven. And it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the priest, even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down." Now, again, last time I'd said this was Antiochus, a king who came from the line of the Seleucids. So one of the horns was the Seleucid kingdom, and Antiochus had come out of that. And he did take away the daily sacrifice. So surely that must be it. It seems to fit in a couple of those respects. But we keep on reading in verse 13 of Daniel chapter 8. It says, Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, and the transgression of desolation, and to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Now in the time of Antiochus, when he desecrated the temple, until the time that the Jewish people kicked him out, retook it, and dedicated the temple, it was a period of about 3 years. That's about 1,200 days, which is well short of the 2,300 days that Daniel was talking about, even if this was just talking about days. But we know, of course, that in prophetic terms, a day comes for a year. So Daniel's prophecy is for a period of 2,300 years. So the 3 years of Antiochus is well short of the 2,300 years that Daniel's referring to. And I'll read something that Newton said in his commentary here. He says, regarding this passage, the last horn is taken by some for Antiochus Epiphanes, but not very judiciously. A horn of a beast is never taken for a single person. It always signifies a new kingdom. And the kingdom of Antiochus was an old one. Antiochus reigned over one of the four horns, and the little horn was a fifth under its proper kings. This horn was at first a little one, and waxed exceeding great. But so did not Antiochus. It is described as great above all the former horns, and so was not Antiochus. His kingdom, on the contrary, was weak and tributary to the Romans, and he did not enlarge it. The fifth horn, was a king of fierce countenance, and destroyed wonderfully, and prospered and practiced. That is, he prospered in his practices against the holy people. But Antiochus was frightened out of Egypt by a mere message from the Romans, and afterward routed and baffled by the Jews. And he continues on with a whole lot of other reasons as well, why it can't possibly be Antiochus. So I was wrong in my interpretation there. Antiochus Epiphanes is absolutely a red herring. So I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here, because there's an important lesson to be learned from all of that when interpreting prophecies. It's very important, and not just interpreting prophecies, we're interpreting scripture and interpreting the will of God in general. We need to be wary of something called confirmation bias. That's when you make up your mind ahead of time about what the scriptures mean, or what the interpretation of the prophecy is, or what the Bible says. And then when you keep on reading, you selectively pay attention only to the bits that agree with your version of events. When you come across scriptures that don't support your side of the story, or that, counter it entirely, you downplay them, or you ignore them, or you come up with some complicated interpretation which kind of twists it and explains it away about why it doesn't actually mean what it quite plainly says in the scriptures. And that's a very dangerous thing to do, because you're corrupting the word of God. But it's also very difficult in the case of things like this scripture, where it seems like such a clear fulfillment of the prophecy. What else could it possibly be? The sacrifice was taken away. Something abominable was done on the altar. It's right in line with, in the same sequence of events that happened with everything else. Like, it seems like a very straight line can be drawn from this to this. And so that must be it. Which leads to, ignoring other inconsistencies with it and trying to make it fit. And in the case of Daniel, Antiochus kind of fit. Everything in the chapter up to that point had been a detailed blow-by-blow account of sequential events unfolding in the Greek kingdoms, with maybe 5 or 10, 15 years between verses. And in the previous verse, we had the event that's depicted here. The ships of Chittim had grieved Antiochus by turning back his invasion of Egypt. And only a few years after that, Antiochus went and defiled the temple and banned the sacrifices. So it must be a perfect fit. But the thing is, I didn't know enough about history to be aware of any other events that could have fulfilled that prophecy as well. And so I tried to make it fit. It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You have to shave off some of the edges that don't work so that it works. And so the lesson here to be learned is really, if the event doesn't completely fit the prophecy, doesn't perfectly fit the prophecy, then it's not the prophesied event. It's important not to ignore the details, especially when it comes to the word of God. The details are very important. It's a straight and narrow path. There's no room for misinterpreting or going off on your own tangent or putting your own version of events on things. It says in the book of Mark, chapter 13, verse 22, for false Christs and false prophets shall rise and shall show signs and wonders to seduce, if it were possible, even the elect. So if you see signs and wonders that don't quite match up with the scriptures, don't quite match up with the way God says things would happen or the way that God does things, it's important to reject them as being untrue, as being false. Even if there isn't an alternative that you know about. It might seem like this has to be it, but if it's not quite right, maybe the promised event is still in the future, still coming. If, for example, you see a road man coming through the clouds with the sound of saxophones instead of trumpets, reject it. It's not the second coming of Christ. It's a lying sign. Wait for the true promise. It also says in the book of Habakkuk, chapter 2, verse 3, it says, for the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry. We can't see the full picture of God's plan. We can't see what's going to happen in the future. We can't see the future event that will perfectly fulfill the prophecy. And so we naturally have doubts when something comes up that's very close, that seems like it should. But God has made certain promises to us in his word, and he is true and faithful to carry them out. We see that time and time again, historically, in the Bible. Examples of God making a promise and then fulfilling it, and making a promise and fulfilling it. And we see time and time again people not waiting long enough for the fulfillment of the promise. A perfect example is Abraham waiting for his promised son. And it's something like 25 years after the promise is made by God, and he still hasn't had a child. And so he goes and takes things into his own hand and has Ishmael with Hagar. And you don't want to Ishmael yourself. You don't want to put yourself in the situation where you try and make God's things work and you end up with something that's not quite right, following the wrong promise. And Ishmael caused all kinds of problems for Abraham and his descendants later on. And then just a few more years later, I think another 5 or 10 years later, Isaac came along, the true fulfillment of the promise. And if Abraham had just continued waiting, just continued in patience, knowing that this promise was going to come, even though everything else seemed against it, he would have eventually got there and seen the full fulfillment of his promise. So in the case of, on our part, all we have to do is have faith and trust that God's promises are true and will come if we wait for them. In the case of Daniel chapter 8, that's 2,300 years worth of waiting for the cleansing of the sanctuary. And if we go from the event that I'm thinking about in it, which is about 130 AD, adding another 2,300 years is going to put the cleansing of the sanctuary in about 2,400, 2446, which is a good 300 years from now still. Probably well into the millennial period of Christ's reign, but that's another talk entirely. So all that being said, what was the true fulfillment of the abomination of desolation? So going back to set the scene again, here is what the Mediterranean looked like in 190 BC. This was sort of the peak of the Greek imperial period when we had the four kingdoms, the four Greek kingdoms, which were the four horns: Macedonia, Pergamum, the Seleucids, and the Ptolemies. Now, the fifth horn, which was spoken about by Daniel, the one that goes to take away the temple sacrifice and places the abomination of desolation. It says in Daniel chapter 8, verse 9, and out of one of the four horns came forth a little horn. So this little horn that eventually grew up to be the big horn was the Romans. Now the Romans did have their own kingdom off to the left somewhere there in that funny boot-shaped bit of the world. But in this period of time, in this kingdom of Pergamum, there was the last king of the Pergamese. Anyway, the last king of Pergamum, a guy named Attalus III, didn't have any children, and so he very generously left in his will his entire kingdom to the Romans. So the Romans took over Pergamum, became the fourth horn in a way, and their fifth horn came out of this fourth horn. And then it said, and the little horn waxed exceeding great toward the south and the east and toward the pleasant land. So the Romans, expanded across this entire area. And while the map officially looked like this, those Greek kingdoms to the north, Macedonia and Pergamum, were what you'd call client states of Rome. That means that they did whatever Rome told them to do. They followed them into their battles. They sent their troops to fight alongside them, so on and so on. A client state is like an ally, but more like an underling. Think of it as like Australia to the United States. It goes along with whatever they say. So in reality, the map looked more like this. It was all of this was Rome or Rome, and over the next few years, it became more like this, where just everything was Rome. The whole world is Rome, because they eventually conquered all the Mediterranean, all of Mesopotamia, all of Western Europe. So they waxed great and grew towards the south, down there, towards the east, towards the pleasant land, which is Israel, and came to look like this at the height of their power. So Daniel goes on in that same verse, and it waxed great, even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and stamped upon them. Now, stars in prophetic symbolism always refers to rulers, kings, princes, the top people in nations. And as the Republic of Rome expanded, it conquered and absorbed many of the smaller kingdoms around the place. At this time in the world, most countries were what's called city-states. You have a city, and that city has a king over the city, and they rule the little area around them. An empire is when you have one kingdom that expands itself to encompass other kingdoms, and you have the emperor, which is a king of kings, sort of a king over all the other kings. So when Rome expanded, technically it was a republic, but it's still symbolically it's this nation taking over everyone else. It conquered and absorbed many smaller kingdoms in the surrounding lands, and deposed their kings, which is, as it says in Daniel, casting the stars to the ground, and subjugated their people and put them in service and taxation to Rome, or stamping upon the nations. It goes on to say, yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. Now, the prince of the host, the highest ruler, the greatest of all, is, of course, Jesus, the prince of the heavenly host. And as we see in the Gospels, Jesus was killed by the Romans, which is this fifth horn exalting itself against the prince of the host. And then after it exalts itself against the prince of the host, it says, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. So we can see that the events, once again, this abomination of desolation and taking away the sacrifice, must have happened after the death of Jesus. So when the Roman general Titus sacked the city of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, he tore down the second temple, which was the place of the sanctuary. This was as Jesus prophesied in Mark 13, verse 2. It says, as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples saith unto him, Master, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. And Jesus answering said unto him, Seest thou these great buildings? There shall not be one stone, there shall not be left one stone upon another, that shall not be thrown down. Now this is sometimes thought of as the abomination of desolation, but we're still not quite there yet. This is, as I said in earlier in Daniel, the daily sacrifice was taken away and the place of the sanctuary was cast down. So this is a different event. The abomination is something different. Now, in the book of Daniel, the specific word used for abomination is shikuts. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Um, Word number 8,251 in Strong's Concordance. This is a word that means disgusting and filthy. So I have here a list of all the different words that are translated as abomination or abominable. Um, and a good few of them, shikus, shikuts, shekes, they're all based around the same word. We also have toeba and toneba. Um, and then in the New Testament, when Jesus is talking about it, um, since the New Testament's written in Greek, he uses the word, he uses that word. I don't know how to pronounce BD next to each other, but um, once again, it describes whatever is happening as a foul and detestable thing, as an abominable thing. Pardon me, my headphones are just running out of battery. Um, so this word shikuts, um, it means disgusting, filthy, idolatrous, detestable. It's the same word that's used in the book of Leviticus when it's describing foods that shouldn't be touched, pork and that sort of thing. Um, but it also appears in the books of First and Second Kings when it's describing the temples that Solomon built to the heathen gods. In First Kings chapter 11, starting in verse 4, it says, "For it came to pass, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites, or the Shikuts of the Ammonites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the Lord, as did David his father. Then did Solomon build a high place for Chemosh, the abomination, the Shikuts, of Moab, in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination, or the Shikuts, of the children of Ammon." God hates idolatry. It's one of the big themes of the Old Testament that idolatry is like the worst thing you can possibly do. If you look in the book of Exodus with the Ten Commandments, out of the Ten Commandments, the first four speak against idolatry. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 2, commandment 1, "I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage." The second one, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." The third one, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. And the fourth one, "Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God." It's pretty important when the first four commandments are all don't do idolatry. It's just said in different ways. And more to that, when the Lord finally brought down his final judgment and the captivity against Israel, when they were taken away by the Assyrians, the reason he gives for it is punishment for their idolatry. 2 Kings chapter 17, starting in verse 6, it says, "In the ninth year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria, in the ninth year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria, and he carried Israel away into Assyria. For so it was that the children of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, which had brought them up out of the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods. And the children of Israel did secretly those things that were not right against the Lord their God. And they built them high places in all their cities, and from the tower of the watchman to the fenced city. And they set them up images and groves in every high hill and under every green tree." So when the Lord tells Daniel in this prophecy that there will be an abomination placed in the holy place, what he's referring to is idolatry, because abomination is the Lord's sort of word for idolatry. So this abomination that will be set up in the holy place will be an idol or a temple to a false god. Um, just another interesting side note. Um, Historians looking through the land of Israel uh, quite often use the historical evidence to argue against some of the things in the Bible. They say, historically speaking, based on the artifacts that we've found, the people in Israel were not monotheistic at all. They didn't worship one God, so the Bible mustn't be true. However, if you do read the Bible, you see that that was kind of the problem the whole time, that they weren't worshiping just one God. You look in Jeremiah, the whole thing is a lamentation that they haven't been worshiping one God. You look at all the condemnations in all the prophets who are speaking against them, saying, come back and worship just one God. You look at it, Kings and Chronicles, where it always said Israel sinned and followed after Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. He did that by setting up the golden calves in Samaria and in Bethel and Dan. The whole problem was that they weren't following just one God. And unfortunately, history holds them to that they were unfaithful to the Lord. We also see in several other verses, particularly in the book of Isaiah, the act of idolatry is compared to spiritual adultery. It's being unfaithful to the Lord. It's being betraying the Lord. But rather than looking to God, the true God, the real God, who can actually answer your prayers, instead going after dumb false idols who can't possibly do anything. And the Lord, being a logical and reasonable um, person, I suppose, looks down on this and sees this, and you can just imagine him in utter disbelief. Like, why are you doing this? Here's me. Here's the Lord. I can give you things. I can bless your life. I can make things work. And instead of following me, you're going after a stick that you carved into kind of a guy, and you think that's going to help you somehow. It's I can see where God's coming from with seeing this as an abomination. So anyway, this is what it was. Something very much like this. Daniel 11, verse 31. It says, "They shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." Important wording there. They shall place the abomination. So Titus's destruction and taking away of the temple wasn't the abomination. The abomination was what came next, something being placed there. And 60 years after Titus destroyed the temple in 70 AD, we get to 135 AD, when the Emperor Hadrian, depicted here in bronze, the same guy who built Hadrian's Wall up in England to keep all those barbarous Scots out, all my ancestors. This same Hadrian went into Jerusalem and rebuilt the city that had been destroyed. And on the side of the Temple Mount, he built a temple to Jupiter. And this is what temples to Jupiter tended to look like. Just so you've got a bit of an idea. This isn't the actual temple to Jupiter. That was destroyed at some point. I'm not sure now. And today, on the side of the Temple Mount, there's a Muslim shrine, the Dome of the Rock. But back in the day, in 130 BC, Hadrian came and built a temple to Jupiter on the site of the old Jewish temple. And just like the temples to false gods that Solomon built were considered an abomination to the Lord, this new temple that Hadrian built to another false god was also considered an abomination. So this is the abomination. And the second part is that the abomination would make desolate. So the Jewish people were well aware that a heathen temple was an abomination to God. They'd been through the captivity in Babylon and in Assyria. They knew what they did wrong. They knew that their problem was idolatry. So seeing more idolatry right on the side of the temple was, well, they had a pretty bad reaction to that. And their reaction to the construction of this temple is what led to the desolation. So in the year 132 AD, just after this temple was built, a Jewish man named Simon Bar Kokhba led a revolt against the Romans. And that lasted for a period of about 4 years. Here's a depiction of it where we have, Roman Tetsudo in the streets of Jerusalem, probably, and all the various Jewish rebels fighting against them. So this revolt lasted for about 4 years. And that was almost exactly 100 years after Jesus spoke about it. In the book of Matthew, chapter 24, and starting in verse 15, We read the start of this earlier. It says, "When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them that be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be." Now, some people take Jesus' statement here as an argument for the futurist fulfillment of the Antichrist, the rapture, the Great Tribulation, 7-year period. The argument is, I suppose, not knowing about this event. They say that the Nazi Holocaust in the 1940s was the worst thing that has ever happened to the Jews, worse than anything the Romans did. So when Jesus said there's a great tribulation and nothing worse than that will ever happen again, they say, well, the Holocaust was the worst thing that's ever happened, so we must be waiting for something even worse. For this, they say the Great Tribulation. That will be such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be. Now, it's estimated in the Nazi Holocaust in the 40s that about 2/3 of the Jewish population in Europe were killed. And what's interesting is that in this event, in the Bar Kokhba revolt, about 2/3 of the population of Judea were killed. That's an awful lot of people. So taking Jesus' words as truth, which is a pretty good thing to do, I'd say it probably means that this revolt was every bit as bad as the Holocaust and probably worse. So this, I'm fairly confident saying this was the Great Tribulation. See, the Romans cracked down on this revolt as only the Romans can, and only the Romans do, and they killed 2/3 of the Jewish population. The Roman historian Cassius Dio said 985 villages were razed to the ground. 580,000 men were slain in various raids and battle. So that's just the people who were fighting. Just out of the people who were fighting, 580,000. And the number of those that perished by famine, disease, and fire was past finding out. So too many people for them to count who died when the villages were raided, when they couldn't find food afterward, when they were sick and they couldn't get better afterwards, when fires raged through all these different places. He says, this secular historian says, thus nearly the whole of Judea was made desolate. Even the contemporary secular sources use the word desolate to describe the land. Just like Daniel said, it's the abomination that maketh desolate, and the land was made desolate. But even after 2/3 of the people were wiped out of the remaining people who survived, over 100,000 were sold as slaves and sold to other countries, sold to buyers from all over the world, and sent all over the place. And the rest of them were exiled from Judea. The Romans were so sick of putting up with the constant Jewish rebellions in this place that they just finally kicked them all out of Judea entirely. And it wasn't for another 1,812 years in 1948, when the nation of Israel was reestablished, that they were allowed to come back. So for a very good period of time, Israel was desolate of the Israelite people. And my slides abruptly end there. So there you have it, that right there, or something very much like that. The Temple of Jupiter being built in Jerusalem was the abomination that makes desolate. And I'd like to leave it there.